So our next speaker is Ben Heckscher. He's the co-founder of the local rail advocacy group called Trains in the Valley. It's a great organization out in Western Mass. They have a wonderful website, which is something that should be emulated by many other rail advocacy organizations across the country. So, Ben, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Richard, for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm going to share my screen. Where are we? Yes, here. And go into presentation. Okay. 1 second. To minimize all that. Okay, so I'm going to give a presentation here for about 25 minutes on what's been happening with East-West Rail and the service known as the Valley Flyer, which runs north and south between Greenfield and New Haven. Just as an introduction, I moved to the area with my wife in Western Mass in 2014. Started this group, Trains in the Valley, with, I'm a co-founder. The other co-founder is a man named Zane Lemelski. We've been operating the group for a couple of years now, and we've been learning basically something new every day. Rails are really, or can be a rather complicated topic, especially when you go into some of the sort of the weeds of what it takes to get this done. I'm going to talk briefly here just to give you, for those of you from outside the area, hopefully you can see this. This is a map known as the Open Railway Map, which is available on the internet. Can you see that okay, Richard?
Yep, we can.
Okay. And so the line we're going to be talking about today is referred to as East-West Rail, which runs here between Boston on the right-hand side of your screen to Framingham, Worcester to Springfield, and on to Pittsfield. And then when I talk later about the Valley Flyer service, it runs on this corridor here from Greenfield up and down. Hopefully you can see my cursor also. But this is a wonderful resource on the internet if you haven't found it yet. Lets you zoom in and see most any rail line anywhere on the planet, including rail lines that don't exist anymore. Let me go back to where I was. And for people outside the region, we actually do have a form of East-West Rail service that's operating today. It's Amtrak's train 448 and 449, known as the Lakeshore Limited. The train operates between Boston and Albany with connecting, that's not connecting service, sorry, through service in Albany onward to Chicago. For those of us in Massachusetts, what's most interesting is it does offer a way to get from Springfield to Boston. Unfortunately, the train is often very late coming in from the west. And so people, I think the average delay is 45 minutes, it can be a couple of hours late. But there is a service. So when people say, well, how can you have a service with only one train? I would say one train is better than no trains. So a little background that I'm going to go through quickly on East-West Rail. The topic, sort of the modern history of East-West Rail, started in 2013 with Governor Deval Patrick, introduced a rather bold plan for economic growth in the Commonwealth over the next 10 years. And if you look at this list here, you can see South Coast Rail, which is a project that is actually under construction now and will open in a couple of years. The Green Line extension, which is also under construction and will open soon. South Station expansion, which MassDOT designed, or they earmarked as something they wanted to work on, but it really hasn't moved forward except for some infrastructure work. And then something here called the Inland Route, which is a historic name for a service that runs between New Haven, Springfield, and Boston. And in his plan, he allocated or wanted to spend $362.4 million to get that service running. And then further down the list, you can see The Berkshire Line, $113.8 million for service to New York, and $20 million to restore service to Cape Cod. And that service did get restored a couple years later, at least on a limited basis, in the form of the Cape Flyer. As often happens in these kind of things, immediately a study was initiated. They started something called the Northern New England Intercity Rail Initiative. This was managed by both Vermont Agency of Transportation and MassDOT with input from ConDOT. This is a picture of the output of the study, which was about 1,300 pages. I'm not going to go into too much details of the study, except to look at this chart, which shows that the final recommendations were for one additional service between New Haven and Montreal, one service from Montreal to Boston, and 8 trains running through from New Haven to Springfield to Boston. The New Haven to Montreal service was never established. MassDOT quickly dismissed any idea of putting service on between Boston and Montreal. And ConDOT went forward with service from New Haven to Springfield in the form of the Hartford line. But at this time, in 2016 or so, no further effort took place to move forward with East-West Rail between Springfield and Boston. You know, the real reason that happened, I would say, was that the governor changed. Deval Patrick left office and Governor Baker came in, and the administration changed, and they completely changed their focus towards other priorities. And that happened in 2016. In 2018, under a great deal of pressure from Senator Lesser, Congressman Neal, the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and advocates across the region, Governor Baker finally announced that he would do a study of East-West Rail. Now, many of us pointed out that they'd already done a study, which was 1,300 pages long, but you know, often DOTs, when they don't want to do something, they'll study it again. Or sometimes we say in Massachusetts, before anything big gets built, you have to study it at least 3 times. So this was the second study of East-West Rail. This picture shows the first meeting of the advisory committee that was put together for East-West Rail. It's about 30 people. They were meeting in Springfield here. If there was one really positive outcome of the East-West Rail study, the people who were part of the advisory committee became very well versed on any number of topics related to operating passenger rail in ways that they never knew before, having sat through hours and hours of advisory committee meetings. This is one page of the output from the East-West Rail study, and I won't go into too much detail of it, except to say that they looked at 6 options for study as part of this work. One of the options, the sort of most basic service, was between South Station and Springfield with a bus connection to Pittsfield. And the highest level of service, they actually studied establishing true high-speed rail between Pittsfield, Springfield, and South Station, which they did not take into the final round of review because the price tag was, I think, $25 or $26 billion. And they decided at this time, that was not something they were going to move forward with. Now, one other thing I'll mention about this map was the study did not look at service that went through Springfield to New Haven, and it did not look at service that extended past Pittsfield to Albany. Now, many people would say that was an oversight, but MassDOT in the meeting said that was done on purpose. MassDOT's words, we had to ring fence the study, which is their way of saying we had to limit the study to, you know, a certain area for review. And that's as far as they would go as far as this study. Coming back to what Karen said earlier, part of the challenge with these kind of things is for MassDOT to look at service past Springfield to New Haven, it crosses a state line. And crossing a state line is a really difficult thing, it seems, for DOTs to do unless the federal government is involved with the project somehow. So there were 6 meetings of the advisory committee. There were 3 public meetings. A notable thing happened in the spring of 2019. The 4 advocacy groups out here in Western Mass, which were joining all of the meetings to participate, formed a coalition known as the Western Mass Rail Coalition. So we meet probably every 1 to 2 months at the moment by Zoom to sort of talk about what's going on, the kind of strategy we want to look to push. And we write op-eds to the newspapers, and we have a page of information online. You just search on Western Mass Rail Coalition, you'll find some information. We're not an advocacy group per se, but we're a group of advocacy groups. So we're a coalition that's come together to work together to push forward at the moment East-West Rail, which is what we have been working on. This study was completed with a final report released in early January of 2021. Out of the study, there were 4 items listed as next steps. MassDOT said that before moving forward, they had to better understand CSX's requirements for operating passenger rail on their right-of-way, noting in particular that CSX's requirements added as much as $1.5 billion to the total cost of the project. And most of this was enhancements that would have had been made to the right-of-way to separate the track centers between the tracks. Second, they said that there has to be another study done. Coming back to my statement about additional studies, they wanted an economic and demographic study done to see what the benefits of East-West Rail would be. And this is something that State Senator Lesser had argued for many years now, probably 5 years now, should have been the basis to start off East-West Rail. And instead, what DOT did is they went off and they did an infrastructure study rather than an economic study. They also said there needs to be a white paper developed to understand how it is, or how would we, the state, operate passenger rail service in Western Mass, considering we, MassDOT, don't operate trains per se. You know, the MBT operates the trains in the MBTA service district, but the trains outside of the MBTA region are operated, intercity trains are generally operated by Amtrak. And there needs to be some kind of governance defined from MassDOT's perspective before we can move forward with East-West Rail. And then additionally, obviously, the state has made very clear that before East-West Rail could move forward, there needs to be a funding source identified. And basically the funding source they're looking for is the federal government. Another second notable event this year, on the 16th of January, the governor signed a new transportation bond bill. This bond bill allocated $50 million that could be used for East-West Rail, and the bill has been signed. Does it mean that they will use the $50 million? No, it does not. But it is a source of state funds that the state could use should they decide to spend state dollars on East-West Rail, which they haven't done yet in 2021. In March of 2021, as everybody in this call probably knows, President Biden released his proposal for the American Jobs Plan. This included $80 billion, or proposed $80 billion over 8 years for Amtrak and intercity rail, which is obviously a very sizable chunk of money. And there's hope that if this proposal moves forward through the Congress and gets to Biden's desk, that there will be considerable money in this bill that could be used to work through the first early steps of the East-West Rail project. Many of you on this call are probably also familiar with the 2035 vision map that Amtrak released at the end of March. This is an excerpt of the national map, and if you look closely, you see there's a blue line here between Albany, Springfield, and Boston. This is Amtrak basically saying, you know, should you, New York and Massachusetts, decide you want to run a corridor service between Albany and Boston, we'd love to run it for you. It doesn't mean that Amtrak is going to go off and build a service between Albany and Boston without some, you know, basically push from the states to make that happen. But it is notable that, you know, basically the Albany, Springfield, Boston, East-West Rail route made it to Amtrak's, you know, vision or aspirational plan for what they'd like to see in the future. Just a couple of weeks ago, MassDOT released what's known as their capital investment plan At least there was a detailed presentation of it at the board meeting on this date. And notably, looking through that presentation, there's no mention of East-West Rail. So what that means, assuming this doesn't change, which it probably won't, is that MassDOT is saying to its board of directors that the capital investment plan they've developed for the next year, fiscal year 2022, does not envision any money will be spent moving any element of East-West Rail forward at this time. Now, of course, that could change, in particular if the federal situation improves and the infrastructure bill moves forward. And then we come to the end of April, and our friends in Connecticut at the Connecticut Regional Council of Governments, they released a very interesting economic report on what the establishment of passenger rail between New Haven, Springfield, and Boston would do to the region. This is the inland route that I mentioned from the Neary study back in 2016. Now, it's really interesting from my perspective that this report was developed by our friends in Connecticut with the help from the Planning Authority in Springfield, with no input from our friends in Boston. So it's basically Western Mass, which has very tight economic ties with the counties to the south in Connecticut and New York City, basically working with Connecticut to see about what can be done to move passenger rail forward, because quite honestly, ConnDOT is very interested in getting some of their service from the Hartford line through to Boston in some way, shape, or form. I don't know if that's Amtrak service or it's CT rail trains running to Boston or it's something, but they are trying to find a way to move that forward. And MassDOT, at the moment is not so interested. So this is one of the slides that they produced as part of the study. It was an economic study, but it's interesting that the economic study that was done here was done by the consulting firm known as AECOM, a multi-billion-dollar worldwide firm that does large infrastructure projects. This was the same firm that was the lead on the East-West Rail study that MassDOT recently completed. And it was notable that during the press conference, the person from AECOM made note that we all realized that the ridership numbers of the East-West Rail study were lowballed. I mean, they were sort of admitting what many people were saying, except MassDOT, who pointed to the AECOM numbers at the time of the study and said, oh no, these are what the numbers are. So again, this study is making the argument that East-West Rail needs to move forward with service between Pittsfield, Springfield, and Boston, as well as through service from New Haven, Springfield to Boston. As Karen mentioned before, notably on May 5th, Congressman McGovern and Senator Markey reintroduced the brain train bill. I also don't have the full words for what the brain train bill stands for, except it's a multi-billion-dollar annual investment in inner city rail. Most likely the wording in this bill will be rolled into either the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act that will have to go through later this year, or the infrastructure bill, one or the other. There's a lot of very complicated things happening within Congress right now to figure out how to move forward with some of the infrastructure plans that the Biden administration wants to see happen. Just one second. So just finishing up East-West Rail, there is no real path forward at the moment, but there's hopeful signs. The key players politically here are Governor Baker and Richard Neal. Congressman Neal is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He has a great deal of political power, shall we say, to make things happen within the Congress. And with that power, I think he has his phone number in. He can speak with Baker. He speaks to Baker on a regular basis, and he's made very clear that he's talking actively with Baker about East-West Rail. We also have a number of significant members of the Congress in leadership roles in this session, and there's considerable interest in East-West Rail. We're very hopeful that it's going to move forward, but for that to happen, something's going to have to happen within Congress from the perspective of funding, and that'll be the next major step. because MassDOT's not going to move forward by itself from what we can see at this point. Now, if there was a new governor, and there will be a new governor someday, that's going to change the equation, of course. But at the moment, MassDOT's not so excited about East-West Trail. So now we're going to jump to Valley Flyer for a few minutes. This is a picture actually on the platform in Northampton that was taken in early April with, I think, 18 or 20 people boarding the train heading south to New Haven, most likely for connections on to New York City. It's a hopeful sign that ridership will come back as we get near the end of the pandemic here. The Valley Flyer was announced in 2018 by MassDOT as a so-called pilot, which is a vehicle they use to sort of launch passenger rail service with a certain amount of time. And if the service is successful, in this case, 2 years, they'll continue the service. If it's not, they will cancel the service. The service was negotiated with MassDOT, ConnDOT, and Amtrak because what the train actually is an extension of the Amtrak Hartford line trains that run today between New Haven and Springfield. Two of those trains now originate in Greenfield and run down to New Haven rather than being originating in Springfield. It's an intercity service. It's not a commuter service, which means it's priced as an intercity service, which is really unfortunate because if you board the train in Springfield to go to New Haven, it's 1/3 the price than if you board the same train in Holyoke, which is only 8 miles north. This is probably a little bit difficult to see, but it's what we created to try to explain to people how the service works from a scheduling perspective. It's a timetable basically, but we don't call it a timetable because it's not an official timetable. But what we show here is the Valley Flyer southbound train from Greenfield connecting in New Haven with either Amtrak or Metro North. Amtrak will never tell you that their trains connect to Metro North. And Metro North generally won't tell you that their trains connect to Amtrak trains running up to Greenfield. It just, these agencies operate as distinct entities in this country, most of them. And Amtrak runs Amtrak, and C2 Rail and, well, the Hartford line's a little different, but Metro North runs their own operations. So we put a joint timetable together that shows the different connections because we know there are people that take the train to New Haven and then connect to Metro North to, as example, to get to Fairfield, which you can't do if you just connect to Amtrak. So we wanted to show people the possibilities. We also show on this page the sample prices, which is something Amtrak hasn't put on any kind of a timetable probably in a dozen years or 20 years. Service was launched in August 2019. In March of 2020, the Vermonter was suspended because of the pandemic. North of New Haven, it's now suspended at the moment, north of New York City. The Vermonter will resume on July 19th over its full route. Once again, we're thankful of that. In September, there'll be a marketing campaign that will kick off for the Valley Flyer. This was supposed to happen earlier, but it was delayed, obviously, because of the pandemic. There's $350,000 of available state funding that's been allocated for this marketing campaign, which is frankly a lot of money. $100,000 was kicked in by MassDOT, and $250,000 was part of a budget, I think a year or two ago, that was added as an amendment to the budget by State Senator Joe Comerford. When the second Valley Flyer round trip will resume, we're not sure yet, but we're putting pressure on them to change the timetable because the problem with that train at the moment is the northbound train arrives back in the Pioneer Valley all stopped after midnight. So nobody wants to get off the train in Greenfield at 12:14 in the morning, 12:41 in the morning. I hit my time exactly. I'm 5 minutes late, but I started 5 minutes late. So that's where I am. And let me see if I can stop sharing that. How do I stop the share? And that's my presentation. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Great presentation. One question, Ben. Do you have any information on how pre-pandemic ridership on the Valley Flyer was on those trains, 2 trains every day?
We don't have any official information. We have a couple of volunteers that we have a little Google form that we use, and volunteers count people on the platforms. On some days, you'll see very low ridership, 5 to 10 people on a train. And on good days, we've seen as many as 30 people board that train.
And that's without marketing, right?
Without marketing, yes.
Yeah.
But when I say without marketing, if you go on the internet and you search for Valley Flyer, you'll find the information you want, because we put all the information on the Trains in the Valley site.
You have to know about it to do that, though.
You go to the Amtrak site for the Valley Flyer, you'll get a couple pictures of towns in the region and information of where the train runs, but nothing that gives you information about the stations, as example.
Right, right.
So we're very hopeful that with a marketing campaign, and getting past the pandemic and getting people back on trains, that people will be willing to use the service. What we did see is it was quite often that people would take the Valley Flyer southbound and the Vermonter northbound, because it arrived back in the region in the afternoon rather than late at night.
Perfect. You have a question from Fritz from the Railroad Workers Union. Fritz, unmute yourself, please. Or if you can't, we can.
Yeah,
oh, you did it.
I'm right
okay,
here,
great.
but I don't think I raised a question.
I see your hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. I appreciate your presentation here. I'm listening.
Great. Any other questions?
If there's anybody that has a question on a
I see a
telephone,
hand up.
yeah, we will do that. Basically, if you're on a telephone, if you would dial *9, that will show us you're raising your hand, and we can go.
Paul Goodrich has a question. Oh, but he's muted.
Joe Mulligan.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me now?
I'll stop.
We can hear you.
All right. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Hi, Paul.
The Rensselaer station is so well served by Amtrak. It seems like if in any east-west study, it seems like Albany or Rensselaer Albany through to Boston would be the smart move if it was going to be an Amtrak train to increase ridership from further west. What do you feel about that?
It obviously makes sense. I mean, the population in Albany, I don't recall the numbers. Karen put them out in a presentation I think I saw the other day, is multiples higher than the Pittsburgh region.
It's about 90,000.
Yeah, there's a much larger population in Albany. There's an economic connection between Western Mass and the Albany region. And it would make total sense. The problem is it crosses a state line and becomes much more complicated, from my perspective, for the state DOTs to work across these state lines by themselves to do these kind of services. So what they did is they, under great pressure to do an east-west rail study, they said, let's keep it simple in a sense, and we'll go as far as we politically have to, and that's Pittsfield. So they went Boston, Springfield, Pittsfield, and that was it. They didn't consider New Haven, and they did not consider Albany in this study.
Even though that's the completely rational thing, and people keep bringing that up.
Right. It comes up time and time again. Yeah. What about Albany? And MassDOT will simply say it's not part of the study. Thank you.
And that's part of the problem with Amtrak's new plan. An example of that, they're trying to restore service to Rockford, Illinois. And believe it or not, the Illinois DOT provided money for a feasibility study to extend service to Dubuque, Iowa. And so Amtrak only wants to go to Rockford, which makes no sense at all. And that's also true with the proposed service to Moline. If you're going to go to Moline, Illinois, you might as well continue on to Iowa City at the very least. But for some reason, these state DOTs and Amtrak really don't understand how you can work with other DOTs to make sure that you really develop a service that people will utilize. So if there's no other questions, I want to thank our friend out in Western Massachusetts, Ben Heckscher, for a great presentation. And we are going to take a short break. Let's just take a 5-minute break and we'll be right back.